And I want to thank my good friend and fellow writer, Cary Griffith, for participating with me, my partner, Jane, who's now taking pictures of me, for always being supportive of me and my work, and all of you for coming tonight. Thank you very much. In his testimonial for my novel, Junot Diaz wrote, "The gravity of love is a magnificent, haunting duet of grief, absence, and the unshakable bonds of family." The voices of this duet are those of Ginny, a woman in her early 70s, and of David, her son. When the acquisitions editor at Between the Lines Publishing offered me a contract for the publication of The Gravity of Love, she commented that my novel reminded her of James McBride's The Color of Water, in which the chapters alternate between McBride's point of view and that of his mother. I was very flattered by her comment. McBride is an excellent writer, and The Color of Water is a very powerful book. However, there are some significant differences between his book and mine, far more significant than just the fact that my book is a novel, and his is not. The Gravity of Love does not have any chapters. There are pauses, but no chapter breaks. The novel is divided into 5 parts. The second and fourth parts are narrated in the first person by Ginny, while the first, third, and fifth parts are narrated by her son, David. The stories of these two principal characters complement one another in such a way as to form a novel. But there is a third principal character, John, the husband of Ginny and the father of David. John has been dead for well over 20 years, but he is still a very powerful force in the lives of David and Ginny. I'm going to introduce you to these two characters by reading the opening pages, of part 1, narrated from David's point of view. I stood in front of our bedroom window, buttoning my shirt, looking out at the slope of our backyard and the yellow-green lawn that ends where the tall grass of the woods begins. I was watching the mist rise in wisps among the trees and evaporate in the shafts of sunlight off to the side, feeling exhausted and listless after again waking up before dawn and staring at the ceiling in the dark. I'd returned a few days ago from a conference where I'd given a paper on a French writer, a paper that had to become an article someday, and I would give another one on another writer in the fall at another conference, and on ad infinitum. I felt trapped, and the only way to escape that feeling was to get up, get dressed, and get to work, so I could stop thinking. Barbara came between me and the window, turned her back toward me, and asked me to fasten the hook on her dress. "Look at those squirrels," she exclaimed. "They're putting on quite a show." 2 squirrels were scrambling up and down one of the trees, looping left and right, switching from pursuit to counter-pursuit, all at whiplash speed. She leaned into me and I pressed my face against her hair, breathed the faint fragrance of her body, grazed the back of her neck with my lips and hummed. She turned around, grinned in response to my smile, kissed me and whispered, "Tonight." We had breakfast and left. She pulled out of the driveway, turned onto the road in front of the farmhouse we were renting, and headed for the highway that would take her to Cedar Rapids and her job as an art director. I turned the other way, heading for Iowa City and my job as a professor. After my second class, I'd have coffee as usual on Fridays with a few of my grad students, who would probably go on and on about Jesse Jackson taking the fight all the way to the convention, and then I'd stop off at Prairie Lights Books and browse the shelves and talk with the owner. And in the evening, Barbara and I would go see a student production of a play by Mamet. And in 5 weeks, the semester would end, we would move to Minneapolis, and Alan would come stay with us for part of the summer. The thought of him coming made me step on the gas, as if by driving faster I could move ahead in time. Approaching the top of a hill, I realized something I could see might be on the other side. I hit the brake and slowed down, just as I passed the crest and saw in front of me a tractor towing a manure spreader. From my office desk, I looked up at the picture I'd taken of Alan the summer before, a close-up of his face, his big grin revealing his front teeth and 2 gaps where he'd lost his baby teeth. Not knowing how I could make it through 9 months without him, except for a visit at Christmas, I'd had the picture blown up to poster size and hung it on the wall. Every day that I come to my office, I look at him, at his deep brown eyes, his mother's eyes, smiling back at me. Sometimes I feel again what I lost, what I destroyed, and have to look away. I look down at my notes on my survey course on the French novel. The students were undergraduates, likely to fall in love in the next few years if they hadn't already, and they would have to live with the consequences. Maybe that was in the back of my mind when I had made up a list of questions they had to answer for each character who fell in love. Questions like, what does one character see in the other? Does he or she actually see the other? Is there something that mediates the character's perception of the other? And more, so many more questions for something that might seem obvious. As I opened Swan's Way to one of the passages describing Swan's obsession with the dead, the phone rang. David? A woman repeated my name, her voice tense. It was my sister, Patty. I called you at home several times, but you didn't answer. What is it? What's the matter? Ken called last night. He's scared. Mom didn't come home from work. He wanted to know if I talked to her. I told him she hadn't called. He said he'd call Linda. When he didn't call me back, I called him. Linda didn't know anything either. So he contacted the police and they came to the trailer and helped him file a missing person report. I could hear her crying as I gripped the phone. She took a deep breath. He called again around 1 this morning to find out if I'd heard anything. I've been up most of the night. I called him and Linda this morning, but they don't know anything. She fell silent, her breath trembling, and added, I'm scared. I am too. Why didn't you call me last night? You're in Iowa. How could you have helped us? Besides, we've got enough people already who can't sleep. Oh God, what if she's run away? What if she's been kidnapped? What if? Don't do that to yourself. I took a deep breath and another. We've got to stay calm. What can I do? I don't know. I tried to think. Look, why don't you check in again with Ken and Linda and anyone else Mom might have talked to and see if you can find out something. I've got a class to teach. When I'm done, I'll call, okay? I'm so scared. I'll call you. We hung up. I looked at my watch, a couple minutes after 9. I took a few deep breaths and tried to focus on what I had to do. I went to class and lectured about Swan, the aesthete, falling in love with Odette, the courtesan, and his perception of her mediated by the image of a woman from one of Botticelli's paintings. I projected slides of the trials of Moses in the Sistine Chapel, a fresco of scenes from the prophet's life, and close-ups of Zipporah, the woman who would become his wife, with her thick blonde hair, big brown eyes, and lips parted as if she were catching her breath. And then I had the students look at Proust's text, in which Swan gazes at a reproduction of Zipporah and holds it close, imagining he's embracing Odette, his living, breathing Botticelli. As the students focused on the text, the memory of the phone call surged. My mind became riveted to it, to the panic in Patty's voice, the fear that something might have happened to Mom, and to the raised hand of a student distracted me. I called on him and tried to listen to his question. So what you're saying is this guy, Swan, falls in love because of a painting and... He paused. I nodded, wanting to encourage him to complete his question, but my mind drifted. The student disappeared, and I saw a photograph of Mom, her eyes dilated and circled with black rings, like she hadn't slept in days, or like some coke addict. She appeared to have been moving at the time the photo was taken, perhaps standing up from a sitting position and turning toward the person holding the camera. She looked terrified, as if she'd been ambushed and emaciated, like a death camp survivor, in a black sleeveless dress, with lipstick and brown curls. The photo disappeared, and I found myself in the classroom, with students staring at me. What had happened? I looked at my notes. The words were an incomprehensible blur. I tried to concentrate. Where did I stop? I had to say something. As I focused on the notes, I remembered the student had started to ask a question. I looked up and said, "Do you have a question?" He squinted at me in disbelief. The other students did too. They looked at one another and back at me, their mouths hanging open. He must have already asked the question. Blood throbbed through my head. I couldn't focus. "Would you mind repeating your question?" "Okay." He paused as he continued staring at me. I just found it kind of weird. A rich guy falling in love with a prostitute because of a painting. And I'm wondering, well, is that realistic? I mean, Proust is supposed to be a realist, right? And do other characters in Proust fall in love that way? I think we need to go into this in some depth, and I glanced down at my watch and saw the class was to the end. And we really don't have time to continue this discussion today, so for Monday, I want you to read the pages indicated on your syllabus, and we'll start class with a discussion of mediated perception and Swann falling in love with Odette. Have a good weekend. I grabbed my notes and book, headed for the door and down the hall, oblivious to everyone around me. I ducked into my office and collapsed at my desk. I picked up the receiver, noted my hand trembling, and stared at it. I shook my head and dialed. Patty answered after the first ring. I haven't heard anything more from Ken, and Linda's not answering. She's probably left for work. I'll drive up. What can we do? Nothing. We can wait. I'll wait with you. I called Barbara. She wanted to come, but we decided she should stay at work, and I'd get back to her as soon as I knew something. Haunted by the picture of Mom, I flew down the highway, remembering a time long before Ellen was born, when Chantal and I were graduate students at the University of Minnesota, and we'd gone to visit Mom and Ken in their trailer house in Roseville. Ken had set up his screen in the living room and his carousel slide projector on an end table. I knew we were in for another boring evening, sitting on the couch, staring at pictures of his brown pickup with a white camper, or his aluminum fishing boat resting on a boat trailer, or of him holding on a string of walleye under his proud grin. Sometimes there'd be a shot of Mom, but it was like she was just filler. That evening, while we watched another slideshow, the picture of Mom appeared. I stopped breathing. Chantal must have too, because she seized my hand so hard her nails dug into my skin. Mom's image seemed to remain on the screen for several minutes. No one said a word. A click, the image disappeared, and another took its place. When Chantal and I were driving back from the suburb to our apartment in Minneapolis, she asked about the picture. I've never seen it before. Why does she look that way? What happened to her? I don't know. I was gone, drifting around Europe, or working, trying to save up enough money to go back to the U. Or maybe I wasn't there. For 2 years, 1967 to 69, I was gone. I'd wandered off, like some picaresque character, gone when my mother was suffering and needed me. Chantal rested her hand on my shoulder as I continued driving. She knew there was something I didn't want to talk about. She probably thought we would someday. There was always something I couldn't or just wouldn't talk about. A zone of silence around which I detoured conversations, questions, introspection. And not always intentionally. Feelings I didn't understand, couldn't articulate, couldn't even think about. The cavern inside me made entirely of something missing, an absence, an emptiness that left me feeling worthless, and that hollowed out everything good in my life. Its presence was in the back of my mind, in the words I didn't say, in the emotions that didn't get verbalized. Not even to the psychiatrist I saw after Dad's death. That missing thing transformed everything self-destructive into a temptation. So many times as I drove drunk or stoned down Mississippi River Boulevard, along the river's bluffs, and the headlights brought into view a curve ahead in the road, I'd feel tempted to go straight, and it would all be over. So easy. And I'd feel at peace as I headed for the curve, like a child lulled to sleep in his mother's arms. Instead of driving over the edge, I found Chantal. Dad had been dead for over 5 years, Mom had married Ken, and I'd returned home from my wanderings in Europe, full of rage about the Vietnam War, chanting to myself, burn it down, burn the whole fucking country down. After years of working shit jobs like damp-proofing the foundations of buildings at construction sites with hot, stinking pitch, I started graduate school in French. The day I attended my first department meeting, I walked to Falwell Hall, looking at its steep roof, tall chimneys, and gargoyles. I entered the building and followed faculty members and other TAs down the hall and into a classroom, where I sat down in the back row. As the chairman addressed us, I looked at my side and saw her seated in the row ahead of me, her sandy blonde hair pulled back into a coil. She seemed to feel my eyes on her, and for a second, her dark brown eyes met mine, and I saw warmth and compassion in them. A few days later, I saw that warmth again when I went into the office that I shared with a dozen other TAs and dropped my things on my desk. She looked up from the textbook lying before her, and her gaze felt like the sun shining on the surface of a lake. I walked past the desks between hers and mine and introduced myself. She spoke with a strong accent, so I switched to French, but she continued in English, so I switched back. She took a drag of her cigarette, smiled, offered me one, and nodded toward the chair at the side of her desk. I lit up and sat down. What part of France are you from? Paris. En fait, so, a suburb. Never heard of it. It's one of the inner suburbs. You know Paris? Oh yeah, I nodded and grinned. I spent a year in Europe, most of that time in Paris, living in cheap hotels and staying with friends, hanging out at Le Selac et La Coupole, hoping to run into Jean Genet. I'd heard he hung out there. Genet hung out at La Coupole? She arched her eyebrows. Didn't you know? She shook her head and grinned. Oh yeah, everyone knew that. I also hung out in the cafes and bistros around the Boulmiche, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, et Le Rue Mouffetard. I watched her eyes, they focused on me, interpreting her smile as amused appreciation of my attempt to impress her. I didn't tell her I was always hard up for money in Paris, would often move in with the women I was sleeping with, and begged once on the Boulmiche for money. Avez-vous un franc? So, she smirked, you were hanging out on the Boulmiche in May of '68? Nah, I missed the student revolution. Damn. Had to leave about 2 months before. How about you? You participate in it? Soyez réaliste. Demandez l'impossible. Be realistic. Demand the impossible. Il est interdit d'interdire. It's forbidden to forbid. Faites l'amour, pas la guerre. So you were there. She took one last drag, grinned at me, and arched her eyebrows. Eh oui. Okay, I want to begin our conversation by mentioning that Cary and I met and became friends 6 years ago in the novel writing project, the year-long novel writing course that Peter Guy teaches at the Loft Literary Center. And since then, we get together from time to time for coffee, lunch, even dinner sometimes, at least at night. And we read one another's work, talk about the publishing world and how things are going in that world and everything else that you can think of. Cary participated in the Minnesota launch at Home Bookshop with me, the launch of Avi Black. And we had an absolutely wonderful time that evening. So I want to thank Cary for helping me out with this again. And I'd like to know, Cary, what did you like about The Gravity of Love, if anything?
Let me back up and just explain. I'm going to talk a little bit about The Gravity of Love, but explain a couple things about. Can I get up here?
You want to get up here?
Hey.
Or you can take this.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay,
Whatever.
whatever.
First of all, thank you guys for coming tonight. What a beautiful day, and it's really nice to see everybody here. It's a great turnout. And, you know, thanks to Magers and Quinn. Love this bookstore. If you can, please patronize them. Buy his book. You have to buy his book. But it really helps. We are blessed in Minnesota with great readers, great writers, and great independent bookstores. And I've visited a lot of them across the state, and we really need to remember to patronize these guys because they do us an inestimable service. I liked a lot of things about The Gravity of Love, but before I get into that, I want to mention how I actually met Brian Duren, and that was in, as he mentioned, in Peter Guy's class. But I think the day, I believe it was November or December, where we were going to enroll in Peter's class, his year-long novel writing project. And I was sitting out when we were waiting for the noon bell to ring because there was there was some rumor that there were so many places, there were only so many places in Peter's classes, that he had 12 places that we might not get in. And I think I waited in front, it was before noon. I think Richard was there, Margaret was there, yes. And Sue, some of our classmates, and we were in front, and we got into conversation, we started talking, and up the stairs comes this guy in a winter coat, like I remember it as a navy pea coat with a stocking cap on, and he moved with determination, and he looked like a professor. And I thought, that guy can't be in class. He looks too serious. He comes around us, he goes up and he walks right into the office and applies, and we suddenly realize, oh my God, we got to get in there. And then I didn't really meet Brian until Peter's class, and we met everybody. There were 12 in that class. That was Peter's first class, I think, in 2017. And that was a workshop, so we submitted approximately 25 pages of work, and we got to comment on our classmates' work. And I remember when he was one of the brave ones. He went first, as I recall. and he read this long passage, and everybody was kind of silent, because it was pretty good. And I said, man, you are the master of the run-on sentence. And I was telling this to my wife yesterday, and she said, you can't say that. Don't say that. That's not very nice. And I said, no, I mean that in the most positive way possible, because some of our writers, William Faulkner, Virginia Woolf, Gertrude Stein, they were masters of the run-on sentence. Cormac McCarthy, yes, definitely, yeah, he was too. Yeah, so I mean that in the best possible way. And to the run-on sentence, I would also add, one of the things Peter taught us in that class, or that we discussed, was that good novels, good stories, they create a fictive dream. And that means when you open them up and you start reading them, and there's no magic formula, that's the trick with good writing. There's no magic formula, but when you open it up, you're really interested in the people, you're really interested in the characters, and you're interested in what happens, and you're compelled to keep reading. And I really found that in The Gravity of Love. I found that in all of his books, his other books as well, but especially in Gravity of Love. He created a remarkable fictive dream, and you really want to pick up the book and keep reading. And I was gonna, and the other thing I said about his writing was that I thought he just had a wonderful way with words. I called it elegiac. I was telling him this over dinner tonight, and you pronounced it.
I pronounce it elegiac, but I don't know.
Elegiac, I don't know, but like an elegy, really good writing. And I have a good example of both the run-on sentence and the elegiac, whatever, writing. This is a scene towards the end where he's sitting on Lake of the Isles. He's with his wife, and they're just looking out at the water. And this is his description. And this is 3 long sentences. Again, the run-on sentence example. But the water was boiling with carp, their heavy bodies rolling onto the surface and sinking. And sometimes they'd leap into the air, lunging at something, and splash back into the lake. I felt the resemblance of the world in the novel I was creating to the world before us, a world that felt like home. I watched a man and a woman paddle a canoe from the shadows of one island into the shimmering coins of light on the surface to the shadows of the other island, and a flock of mallards swimming in front of us, their tall feathers sticking up, and as they plunged their heads underwater looking for food, and geese waddling across the grass, stretching their necks and pecking at things I couldn't see. Now, that's just beautiful writing. And that's another thing that I was really compelled with about this book. I don't think there was much more than I was gonna say, except to repeat, buy this book. Any questions?
Do you have any questions?
No.
No.
Originally, Peter Guy was gonna come and do this, and, you know, and it was kind of a bait and switch when Peter couldn't make it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
So I
flew
was-
faster than all
Yeah,
of them.
we did.
Well, do you have any
I
questions?
have a question.
Okay.
You know, one of.
Do you need this? Can you hear us
Yeah,
well
you
without?
have to use the mic,
Okay.
otherwise I have to turn up my hearing.
She said you have to.
You
use
have
that.
to-
I have to- oh, I'm sorry, okay.
Okay. Wow, that's really loud.
Oh, wow.
Very glad. What, you know, he mentioned this briefly about the structure of the book, and it's really 5 major sections. It's David is the main character, it goes to his mother, Ginny, then David, then Ginny, then David. And I was thinking, that was an interesting structure. Unusual for novels. What was behind that? Was that just something that naturally occurred while you were writing the book? Because you really flash back, like even in the beginning, the section you read, you flash back and forth. You introduce Barbara, you introduce Chantel.
Mhm.
You know.
Chantal, yeah.
Well, the reason why it's divided into 5 parts like that is that it sort of borders on stream of consciousness at times. It's kind of close to that without really being stream of consciousness, I think. But I wrote it the way I did, focusing on the character's past and present and the way in which time, the past is constantly in the present. And I wanted to create a flow of thought and emotions and so on. And I didn't want to break that flow up with chapter breaks. It seemed to me totally inappropriate for this book. Peter Guy made the comment in his testimony for the book. He wrote, in lyrical, looping, loving prose. There's quite a lot of alliteration there. Excuse me. Brian Duren has worked toward Proust, the Grand Master of Remembrance. And of course, Proust is also the Grand Master of, among other things, a certain kind of stream of consciousness. And I wanted to create this flow of thoughts and emotions, etc. And as Proust did, who never used any chapter breaks, just divide the book up into parts. Part 1, part 2. Most of his novels, now it's 30, I used to teach Proust when I was a professor, but that stopped 35 years ago. As I remember Proust, part 1 might be a couple hundred pages long, and part 2 might be another couple hundred pages long, or something like that. So you have very, very long parts, and of course, one thing that's different with this book is that the parts are much shorter. The longest one is 80 pages. But I wanted to create a sense. I wanted to give the reader a feeling for the depth of the characters. And I think when we talk about characters having depth, we're using the term depth, which is a spatial term, as a metaphor for time. And I think that bringing the time forward, always having that time constantly threading in and out of the present, helps us create characters who feel real, who have that kind of depth. And again, it seemed to me the most appropriate way of doing this was divide the book into 5 parts and have no chapter breaks at all. So, if that makes any sense? Yeah, okay, all right. Any other questions?
I asked one of this in ivory black too, but this book, from what I know about your background and stuff, seemed really autobiographical, or you use a lot of details from your past. I'm interested, like, what did you change? What were some significant things that you changed? Obviously, the names of the characters and all that stuff. But how, did you feel like it was very autobiographical or no?
Well, there are things from my life that definitely came into the book, but I do not consider it autobiographical fiction. No, I don't. But definitely my life influenced the book. But it is essentially fiction. Things are invented. There are emotions that come from my past that certainly inform the book. There are thoughts about family relationships and so on, and that came from my own family relationships. But I wouldn't consider it an autobiographical novel. For instance, there are, parts of the book narrated from Ginny's point of view that deal with parts of her life that if it was my mother, I wouldn't have known any of this. I would have had to have invented all of it. So there, definitely my life influenced the book. There's no doubt about that. There are some small things that I took from my life and incorporated them into the book. The character's love, for example, for walking around Lake of the Isles, doing some of these things, definitely that came from me. But I wouldn't classify it as autobiographical.
I thought maybe you knew Sandy.
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 There was a woman with whom I had a relationship.
It was an early love interest in
Yes,
the novel.
an early love and interest in the novel, who did have that kind of an impact on me, and there are some things that carried over there, yeah. Anything else? Margaret?
I'm curious, I'm curious as to what changed in the novel from what we read. I do remember that you were very intent on, it's in 5 parts. Sylvia, I remember you very interested in the structure. And I'm just curious as to what you changed and how long, since the class, how long you worked on it, how kind of the process went through.
As with my other 2 books, I revised this book, I don't know how many times, 15 times, I have no idea, 15, 20 times, whatever. I think that I had a pretty clear idea from the beginning of what, generally I have a clear idea of what I want to write when I start to write a book. I mean, I'm writing a novel now called Day Brings Back the Night. It's all in my head, it's done, okay? I've still got a third of the rough draft to finish, but it's done in my head. And I have 2 other novels in my head that are already somewhat planned out. So when I finish Day Brings Back the Night, I'll be ready to start the next one. I finished Ivory Black in January of 2017. And a few days after that, we started the novel writing project, just a few days after I finished Ivory Black. So I'm always ready to go on the next novel.
How long did it take to write
This
this one?
one. Well, I started it, the rough draft, in January of 2017, and I finished the final draft in 2021, so 4 years.
And then how long did it take you to sell it?
To sell it? Well, I kept on revising it all the time I was sending it out and submitting it, because I kept on getting rejections. And so it took 4 years to write it, okay, and do all the revisions and everything. And that doesn't include the editing that the editor and I worked on together. And I think that's kind of typical for me for a book. I always do many, many, many revisions. But I think that the core of the book is very much the same as what you read. I think this is much better than what you read. But it's pretty much the same. There were things that were moved around. Part 1, above all, part parts 1, 2, and 3 changed significantly with revisions, but otherwise it's pretty much the same thing.
Did your editor have a great influence on what you ended up writing in the end?
My editor, we had kind of a tussle. She wasn't too wild about the run-on sentences. Yeah. And Peter Guy and I talked about it a little bit. He said, just work with her and get it done. And that's what I did. So at first I thought I had her convinced that we needed to stick with those really long sentences. And then she talked to her supervisor and said, no, we've got to pull back, no. And so we went back and forth, and we kind of compromised.
And how long was that process?
That process took a few months. Yeah.
Was it fun?
Was it fun? I think at times it was very frustrating, yeah. But I wouldn't call it fun. But I thought the editor that I worked with, we had differences in opinion, different perspective about what good writing is, I think. But we were able to work things out well enough so that we could, I think we were both happy with the end result. She felt that the two voices were more distinct after the editing, and she might be right about that. And I felt that I retained enough of what I wanted to feel that it was still my book. You know, I've heard horror stories about writers having a book edited to the point where when it's finally published, they no longer feel it's theirs, and they don't even want to be involved in marketing it or anything like that, because they just feel the editors took it over and just turned it into something else, you know. And that was not my experience at all, and I found that my editor was very supportive. I think she sincerely believed that everything that she was recommending was the right thing to do. We disagreed sometimes, but we could always work things out, and I think that's probably the way it usually goes between an editor and a writer. Yeah. I'm just guessing on that, by the way.
You know, we have several writers here. Talk
Yes.
about what was the process of getting it published was interesting, frustrating. Mike, can you talk about that at all?
It was horrible. The only criticism I have of the courses that are taught at the Loft is that they never deal with the business of publishing. And they never deal with the issue of the market. They always give you the impression that your book is going to be evaluated strictly on the quality of your writing. And that simply, the quality of your writing is very important, don't get me wrong, it's extremely important. But there are other issues too. And there is, well, let me just talk a little bit about this. When I tried to get my first book published, Whiteout, I tried for years to get it published, and I couldn't succeed. And finally, one night I was watching PBS NewsHour, and the United States Poet Laureate was being interviewed by one of the hosts of that program, and they were talking about the fact that her first book was self-published, her first collection of poems. And I thought, you know, I mean, Proust self-published the first volume of In Search of Lost Time. Sylvia Beach published James Joyce's Ulysses for him. Here's a poet laureate who paid to have her book published. Maybe that's what I should do. And so I had Beavers Pond Press publish my book. Afterwards, I found out there's a horrible stigma attached to self-publication. I tried to get the Star Tribune to review it. And the person to whom I wrote simply sent back a three-word response. Pay to publish, ? And never talked to me again about it. Marianne Grossman wrote back and said, I will take a look at your book and see if it merits being reviewed. So I mailed her the book on a Tuesday. She called me at 9 o'clock the following Monday morning. She said she read the book over the weekend and was blown away by it. And then she said, and I quote, "Why wasn't this book published by one of the majors like Simon and Schuster?" End quote. And I said, I didn't know. After I finished, I don't know, the second or third draft of Ivory Black, I had Brian Malloy review it for me, critique it, and we met to talk about his critique. And then after we talked about the critique, he gave me some advice, and one of his pieces of advice was, as far as submitting it was concerned, don't do anything that might reveal your age. Those were his exact words. And all of a sudden I thought, could it be possible there might be some age discrimination in the publishing world? And, and then I thought about it a little bit, and yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, why would an agent be interested in you if you're into your 60s or something like that, they want young writers, etc. So, yeah, it was not an easy process. For each of the 3 books, it was just going through hell. I mean, I just kept on submitting and resubmitting and resubmitting and resubmitting, in spite of the fact that, I'd have friends read the book, I'd have people at the loft critique it, etc. I'd get very positive responses, and yet, I couldn't get a publisher. So I just kept on looking and looking and looking. I totally gave up on finding an agent, back around 2020 or something like that. After that, I wouldn't spend 5 minutes looking for an agent today. It's really, I think once you get into your 60s, 70s, 80s, agents probably aren't going to be interested in you.
So each of your books has been published 3 different ways, correct?
Yep. Well, no, the first book was self-published. The next 2 were published by traditional publishers, small independent traditional publishers.
Different publishers.
But different publishers, yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Any other questions? Any questions from you? Okay. Okay. Ask another one.
How did you get this one, this publisher?
This publisher, and it's very interesting, is Abby here tonight? Abby? Okay, I don't see her. I've never seen her, but I only know her through correspondence. Abby Masenka heads up a small publishing company that's now located out in Roseville, which is really funny because it's where I grew up. And it's located on Lexington Avenue North, about a block and a half from where my father's bakery was located and where I used to work when I was a teenager. So at any rate, Between the Lines Publishing, the publisher of this book, was founded here about 6-7 years ago, I think, something like that, and then they moved to the East Coast, and then they moved back here. It's just, half a dozen people. They publish, I think, maybe 6 or 7 or 8 books a year. I'm not sure exactly how many. And just kept on looking and looking and looking. I have, for all 3 of the novels, I had at least 100 rejections from agents and at least 100 rejections from publishers, from small independent publishers. So, above all, if you're older, I think that you just ignore the agents and just keep on submitting and submitting and submitting to small independent presses and hope that you'll find one that's interested in your book. Amy?
So when you submitted, did you normally have to send the whole thing, or just 50 pages, or was it different for everybody?
It was different for everyone. I think the majority of them, of the publishing companies, small independent publishers, wanted to see like the first 5 pages or 10 pages or something like that. Some would ask for 25, some would ask for as many as 50. It varied tremendously. I can't remember any publisher, I might have forgotten, but I can't remember any publisher offhand who requested that you submit immediately the entire manuscript. I don't think that happened, but unless you were participating in a contest or something like that, that's different. Yeah. Okay. Richard?
Can you comment on the different experiences you had with two different small press publishers, Between the Lines and the publisher of Ivy Black?
Well, the publisher of Ivy Black is located is Guernica Editions in Toronto, and interestingly, my editor lives on the northwest coast of Spain, and we really hit it off. He fell in love with Ivy Black and then bought a copy of Whiteout, and so and he was totally supportive. I mean, all of his suggestions for revisions were very good, and I immediately agreed with them, and we had a very good working relationship. We also sort of participated in the fantasy of me doing a European tour, which was really funny because there is a large section of Ivy Black that's set in Paris, and the main character in Ivy Black ends up living in a bookstore for a month or so that is very similar to Shakespeare and Company, which is where I lived in 1967 for a month. And so there are a lot of things that kind of attached me to Paris in that book, and I really would have loved to have been able to do a reading of Ivy Black at Shakespeare and Company, and then try to build, create a tour. So we put together a list of bookstores you just really have to visit in Europe, and that was fun. It was crazy. It was totally insane. I mean, it's not going to happen, but we had fun with it. We shared the fantasy, and that kind of bonded us. And the next time I go to Europe, if I get a chance, I'm going to go to Spain and visit him and spend some time with him. We really hit it off. He's also an author, and that's another thing, is that all of the people who work at Guernica Editions are writers. Some of them are writers, are pretty prestigious writers. The publisher, Michael Mirola, has a pretty big reputation in Canada. He's a playwright, poet, short story writer, and novelist, and he's published an awful lot. He's won a lot of awards. And the marketing director with whom I worked is a poet who recently published her debut collection of poetry. She's a very young woman by the name of Anna van Valkenburg, very sharp. I like her an awful lot. My only complaint about Guernica Editions, and I've talked to some of you about this, is that I had an agreement with their publicist that she would handle all of the relationships with the media, and then after a couple weeks after the novel had been published, there were no book reviews, and I was wondering, well, what's going on? And I wrote to her, and I got an immediate response, an automatic response: I don't work here anymore. And I found out she'd left a few weeks before, and eventually I found out that she might not have contacted anyone. And I wrote to Marianne Grossman, and Marianne said, never received a copy of the book, I've never received any emails from her. And luckily for me, Marianne wrote a wonderful review of the book and got it published in time for the event that I had on July 12th. So really wonderful. With Between the Lines Publishing, it's just a very, very, very small press. And as I said, there was some disagreement between me and the editor, but we eventually worked it out. I've enjoyed working with them because they're very upfront about everything that I need to do, that I need to be thinking about, planning, etc. And so it's good with both of them. Yeah. Any other questions? One more? Okay. Got time for one more question. So, who is going to be the one?
I have a question.
Okay, Margaret.
Why didn't you stay with the,
With which one?
Guernica.
Guernica. I didn't stay with Guernica simply because it wasn't a question of staying with them or not staying with them. It's that Between the Lines accepted the gravity of love about 2 or 3 months after Guernica had accepted Ivy Black. And so I just, I didn't know how things were going to go with Guernica, and I was concerned about the fact that I'd be working with a publisher in Toronto. And I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but if you work with a foreign publisher publishes your book, you cannot submit it for a Pulitzer Prize or a National Book Award. That's a joke, Margaret. It's one of my horrible, horrible jokes, okay? But and there was some fallout from that, and that's, of course, originally, The Gravity of Love was supposed to come out in January, and then Ivory Black was supposed to come out in the fall. And then Ivory Black was moved to May 28th. And I thought, well, January and May, I can handle that. And then Abby, the publisher, contacted me and said that, The Gravity of Love is going to be published on June 20th. And I wrote back and I said, but my other novel is coming out on May 28th. And so we moved The Gravity of Love to the end of August.
It's been pretty close.
Yes, but it's still close. And I don't know if any of you read MinPost at all, but Sheila Regan contacted me to talk with me about what writers have to go through to get their books promoted, because I'd brought that subject up when I'd written to some of the people at MinPost, and so she interviewed me about that. And apparently there's been a major change in the publishing world, and that's that writers today have to be much, much more involved in promoting their works than like 10 years ago or something like that. And even someone like Julie Schumacher, with her reputation and everything else and her prestige and, professor in creative writing at the U, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, she talked about all the work she had to do to promote her novels, and in particular the novel that she just published a couple weeks ago, or a month ago or whatever.
I did the first of the trilogy.
But so it's
I don't
hell.
like
I was working on Day Brings Back the Night, and I had to stop working on it 2.5 months ago because it's a lot of work to be your own publicist, and I have a lot more appreciation for them now that I don't have one. As I said, I had the illusion that the publicist was going to take care of all those connections with the media, and I wouldn't have to worry about that. I'd just be seeing eventually book reviews and so on, and that never happened. So, yeah. Anything else? Oh, that was the last question, wasn't it? Oh, one more.
There's one more.
One more. If anybody wants to ask one.
Did you save all your reject letters?
I think I do have them all. Would you like copies?
I was going to say that might be an eventual book.
Yeah, I could turn them into a book. Why not? People have done that done stranger things than that to create a novel. Who was it who gave a presentation here one time ago about a novel that is basically just thoughts about a novel that one might write or something like that? Yeah, it was a Portuguese writer who teaches at NYU. Yeah, and he gave a reading here. Okay, anything else? All right, thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure.